I don't know exactly what time shall we. So we are gathered today to talk about impunity in Malta. It has been a year and a half since Mrs. Caruana Galizia was killed in front of her home. We still need for justice. We still need to understand what happened. We still need a trial. We still need to understand who is the mastermind behind those exactions. And that's where we have this panel. The purpose of today is to remind what Mrs. Caruana Galizia was investigating on, to recall for justice, and to re-stress out expectations, need for policy changes in Malta. This panel is a joint initiative by RSF. I'm representing RSF today as the head of advocacy with other NGOs, Article 19, the CPJ, the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, the European Federation of Journalists, IFEX, IPI, PEN International, and RSF. And we have the chance to be co-sponsored by two members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the European Council, Mr. Stéphane Chenac, and Lord Fuchs, who is the Parliamentary Assembly General Rapporteur on Media Freedom and Safety of Journalists. He has been 26 years an MP in the UK, and is now a member of the House of the Lords. And as the very eve of the last hearing of Peter Hamzek on the investigation on Daphne Caruana Galizia assassination, we wanted to stress out how central it was to find out what happened, and essential to stop the undermining of the rule of law in Malta. And therefore, we are honored to host Lord Fuchs to understand why it's carried on by the Council of Europe, how and what can be resulted by this investigation.
Can I first thank you very much, RSF, Reporters Sans Frontières, and I have very good relations with your colleague Rebecca Vincent in London, and she has been working very hard with me and with others on this case, and I'm very pleased that you've agreed to sponsor this meeting with your colleagues, with your other organizations. And can I say it is a real privilege for me to sponsor this meeting along with my good friend and colleague Stéphane Chenac. We have a lot of other meetings taking place today. It's fraught with this Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly is fraught with issues at the moment in relation to Russia, in relation to budget crisis, so many other things that meetings are taking place. But I thought it was important that this meeting should take place, this side meeting, and that's why I was very pleased to agree to RSF's request to jointly sponsor it. I never had the opportunity of knowing Daphne, although I've now had the privilege of meeting all three of her sons. But having read so much about her life, I would have liked to have known her. She was clearly a very courageous woman, a fine journalist, someone dedicated to uncover the truth at any cost. And it was a really high cost that she paid, tragically paying the ultimate price. But her family should be very, very proud of her. Now, we politicians, we also have a great responsibility to represent those who elect us. We have a responsibility to govern with concern for the people and with accountability to the people. And sometimes we do face unfair criticism in some sections of the media, and that's part of our job. However, there are my co-sponsor, Stéphane, has arrived. However, there are some politicians who abuse their position for personal gain, for power and for money, and exposing them isn't easy, especially when they control all the levers of power in a country, sometimes including some of the media and media ownership. And that's why investigative journalists like Daphne are vital vital for democracy, and hated by demagogues. It's now a year and a half since her murder, but sadly little progress has been made in getting to the truth and getting some justice for her family. I think the Council of Europe is the body that is key to trying to find and to get some justice. We are the body responsible for promoting and defending human rights in Europe, and my goodness, this comes firmly into that category. Tomorrow, our Legal Affairs Committee, Peter, who has been spearheading brilliantly the work of the Legal Affairs Committee, will have a hearing on the case, and I hope that will take it one step forward. As the General Rapporteur on media freedom and the safety of journalists, I pledge to continue to press the case for a proper inquiry, to get to the truth and to find out who were behind Daphne's assassination. That's what we need to work towards. Now, I've got a previously arranged meeting. As I say, there's so much happening, to move on. But can I ask you, I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have now before I go. But can I ask you to let me have, to let Peter have, to let Stefan have your conclusions at the end of this meeting? And then we can pursue it further. I am determined that through the Council of Europe, working with other organizations, particularly the ones who've sponsored this meeting, we will get to the bottom of what happened, of who was responsible. That is a challenge that you give us, and that's a challenge that I'm very happy to take on behalf of the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Fuchs. If you've opened the floor to some of questions, we have a bit of time to take any questions from the floor if there is before you leave. So if anyone has any specific question, we have a bit of time for that. If not, I would thank you very much for co-sponsoring the panel and hosting us in the Council of Europe with Mr. Chenard. And we leave you to your next meeting.
Thank you very much. Can I leave you in the good hands of Stefan and Peter? Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. To carry on the debate, we are very honored to pass on the torch to Andrew Kerena-Galizia, who is the second son of Mrs. Daphne Kerena-Galizia. He has been a career diplomat in Malta. He is now Global Leadership Fellow at the World Economic Forum. And he will present us some of the investigations that his mother was working on, the threats she has been exposed to, and what happened in the aftermath of the assassination, which led us to this very specific place where we still need for justice. Andrew, could you help us picture out what happened, in what context, and how we've been experiencing the need for justice, the lack of progress with national authorities in Malta up to the moment we are standing in?
Thank you very much, Thomas. I always come into these events sort of emotionally very well prepared, but then I hear an introduction like the one given by Lord Fuchs, and it becomes very difficult to separate my role as the son of my mother and my role now as a witness to what happened. I don't have a prepared statement, so I'm counting on Thomas to keep me on a narrow path. Could I just ask, how many of you have heard about my mother? And how many of you heard about my mother before she was murdered? Okay, that's quite a lot of you, at least. One of the challenges that my family faced after she was murdered was control over the narrative. So we were grieving. We had no interest in speaking to the press, in speaking publicly, in getting into a fight with the government. But we very quickly noticed that the Maltese government was trying to shape the narrative around our mother. There was a lot of international press interest, and the government was using the opportunity of our grief to basically dominate the kind of stuff that the international press was reporting. So we found out through journalists that the government was feeding stories to the international press that it was probably organized crime, it was oil smugglers operating between Libya and Malta. And it was really this frustration about the narrative that compelled us to begin speaking out. And one of the first times we did that was here in Strasbourg. We were invited to a European Parliament plenary session, and we gave a private briefing to the press. At the time, we were so grief-stricken, so afraid in many ways that we didn't give any interviews on record. And it's incredible to think back that in this year and a half, the narrative has changed completely. I mean, we worked with the Daphne Project. We worked with any international institution which would talk to us and try to get them to understand the main issues, the context which led to our mother's assassination. So to go to her investigations, our mother self-identified not as an investigative journalist for most of her life. She saw herself as a columnist, someone who led public opinion. And she did lead public opinion from when she was age 25 or 26 years old. She was the most famous political columnist in the country. When we were children, no one knew we were our mother's sons. We would often hear people talking about our mother in front of us, not knowing who we were. She used to drive the political discussion in Malta. And she was attacked for her opinions several times. She spent a lot of time writing about a neo-fascist party in Malta, and our house was set on fire as a result. She also wrote columns about problems in our law enforcement in dealing with drug dealers. But these were always opinion columns, and still she was attacked for that. Things really changed about 4 years ago, or rather 6 years ago, when the current party was elected to government. This political party always hated my mother. I mean, that's really the only adjective to use. They hated her because she destroyed so many political careers in that party. She managed, in large part, to keep them out of government several times. She was an active campaigner for Malta's EU membership at a time when the ruling party was Eurosceptic and campaigning against Malta's membership. And that kept them in opposition for an entire generation, essentially most of my life. And this party blamed her for swaying a huge part of our electorate, about an entire electoral district that often decided elections. And when they came to power, all of a sudden, her sort of political adversaries controlled, as Lord Fawkes put it, all the levers of government. So suddenly she was faced with tax investigations, criminal libel suits actually brought against her by the police, by the state. But then she started uncovering corruption, and this is when her role really changed from a political columnist to an investigative journalist. About 10 years ago, 11 years ago, she set up her own blog. So this gave her complete editorial freedom to pursue whatever stories she wanted and write about whoever she wanted, free from any kind of editorial or legal pressure. And my older brother, Matthew, around this time was working with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which published the Panama Papers. And they together discovered something extremely sinister, that the Prime Minister's chief of staff and one of his key ministers had opened secret companies in Panama. And they had been attempting to open bank accounts around the world. They tried dozens of banks. They were rejected several times. What my mother discovered is they were creating a general purpose offshore structure in which to funnel all kinds of bribes, what in Malta we call euphemistically commissions, from the sale of state assets from massive public contracts. And we would have never found out about this were it not for the Panama Papers. The setup was so sophisticated. They worked with people like Mossack Fonseca, who were the most experienced in the field before they were shut down. No one would have ever found out that these secret companies existed. And when my mother first published these stories in 2016, everything changed. We were all expecting resignations, police investigations. We were expecting an institutional reaction from the state against these politicians. In the end, the reverse happened. There was a state reaction against my mother. So all of a sudden, from the person investigating these people, she became the target. So suddenly she was sued dozens of times by the same group of people. By the time of her death, she was facing 50 libel suits, including 3 criminal libel suits. And her bank accounts had been frozen, so she had no access to her own money. And when my mother realized that the police weren't going to act against these people she named, all of a sudden fear crept in. All of a sudden we realized that there was no real state to speak of, that the institutions were hollow. There was nothing really there. When they finally faced a real test, they collapsed completely. The police commissioner resigned, citing health reasons. During that period, we saw 3 different police commissioners come and go. And the current one is an active supporter of the party in government. The head of our anti-money laundering agency also resigned in circumstances that still haven't been explained. So this is the institutional context. When our mother was murdered, we realized that one of the reasons she was killed is because she was literally the only person investigating political corruption. None of the authorities which our taxes support, which our taxes pay to investigate these crimes, were actually doing anything. So no police officers, no magistrates, no prosecutors needed to be threatened or killed, because none of them are actually actively looking into this. It was only the journalist, my mother, who was targeted. And so we thought that these offshore companies might be linked to one specific example of corruption, but what we realized is that they were all-purpose vehicles. The government had been dealing with Azerbaijan, for example, to create a huge gas-fired power station in Malta. And the minister responsible for negotiating this deal was one of the holders of a secret Panama company. The government also sold a stake in our state utility company to a Chinese state company. So this brings in also security issues, issues related to the independence of the Maltese government in international and European affairs. The government also launched a passport scheme, selling passports for cash without a real residency requirement. And my mother found out that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff was actually actively selling passports and receiving kickbacks from the sale of passports, including to Russian oligarchs. So my mother's stories they were domestic in nature, and she pursued them because they were related to the Maltese government, but they all had an international character. And her work really tells the story of state capture, of a political party in opposition being captured by corporate/criminal interests, winning government, and then all of a sudden repaying its sponsors, its supporters through state contracts. And Malta moved from a situation of sort of local petty corruption, transactional corruption, to massive international corruption involving really corrupt governments like Azerbaijan, China. And what we realized is that in order to make this work, the government had to weaken law enforcement institutions in order to ensure impunity for its own actions. And by doing this, they opened the doors to all sorts of crime, which they currently cannot control. So the diesel smugglers, which the government has named as possible culprits in my mother's assassination, they were never able to operate under previous administrations, but with a weak police force, with a weak judiciary, they operate with impunity.
Impunity is the main theme of that panel, and leads me to Tom Gibson, Thank you, Andrew, very much for this witness, which is kind of difficult to state anyway. Tom Gibson is the EU representative of the Committee to Protect Journalists. He carried on a mission jointly with RSF and other civil society organizations in November 2018 in Malta. Political expectations since then have been expressed very clearly. Unlike you, Tom, to let us know what progress or non-progress has been achieved since then. The risk involves the entire rule of law in Malta, and I'd like you to let us know a bit more about the results of that mission and progress achieved since then.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that the mission is a very good place to start in terms of measuring progress. This was in October of last year for the first year anniversary of the murder. And as Thomas said, the Committee to Protect Journalists with Reporters Without Borders, other organisations, and our intention was to raise concerns around the lack of justice, but also to make an assessment of the space for journalists to work in the country. And so it's good to be speaking here today because I can ask the question, well, what has happened in the past 6 months? Well, locally, nothing much. There hasn't been any real progress in the case domestically. But there has been a continuation of the international scrutiny. We have the resolution that was passed in the European Parliament through the Libe Committee a couple of weeks ago, which includes very strong recommendations. Of course, the Venice Commission with its recommendations. And we are looking forward to the hearing tomorrow from Peter. And all of these things are really creating a very important international pressure. But we're just very concerned as a press freedom community that the status quo remains. 16 months ago, 3 suspects were arraigned. They're still in detention. We have serious doubts that the investigations are going to bring the masterminds to justice at this moment. And in October of last year, we had meetings with the Prime Minister, with the Minister for Justice, the Attorney General. And at that time, we were very worried that there wasn't enough urgency communicated around the need to complete the investigation. There were no indications that all leads were going to be pursued. And when we're talking about all leads, it seems obvious, in a way, that Caruana Galicia's coverage could have been one of the reasons why she was killed, and that would then involve investigations looking at high-level political and business figures within Malta. So our mission also looked at not only the justice side of it, but also the vilification. The case of Daphne Caruana Galizia is striking because of the amount of vilification that she had to live through during her life, but has continued after her murder. So we're still looking at 30 defamation lawsuits that are being continued through the Maltese courts. This includes one from Prime Minister Muscat, which is also being repeated for her son Matthew, because he repeated content that she had initially written about. When we were there, we were also looking at the question of the Great Siege Monument. This is a place where people come and put flowers, put signs, messages, and each time when these flowers are laid, they're cleared up. And again, it just seems that sort of basic freedom of assembly, basic people's right to peaceful protest is sort of, well, it's sort of pressurized, really, or restricted. But during these meetings, we did have commitments from the Prime Minister about a public inquiry, which Keelan is going to be speaking about more in depth after me. He did say it is not a matter of whether, it is when. Now, obviously, a public inquiry which looks into the circumstances of Daphne Caruana Galicia's murder, whether or not it could have been prevented, this is important for the family. This is also important for journalists on the ground. We need to establish what changes to law, policy, and practice can be made. At the moment, I don't think that the Maltese authorities can actually say that they have taken the steps necessary to ensure that another journalist will not be killed in Malta. We know, well, I know the threats that she received during her life. The home was set on fire, family dogs killed, her face plastered on billboards, misogynistic attacks, online harassment. Clearly, this is a situation of insecurity for someone that's carrying out investigations in Malta. Firstly, this abuse needs to be addressed, and secondly, you have to have protection mechanisms for journalists undertaking these type of investigations. And it's really tough to be a critical journalist in Malta. There's a very polarised situation. There's a division between those that support the ruling party and those that are seen as against the ruling party. There's a sort of them and us environment. And critical journalists are marginalised. Now, part of this is economic, that the government provide advertising subsidies to media outlets that are supportive of the ruling party. But we also have this threat of defamation suits, this threat, this sort of Damocles sword which can hang over critical journalists. And the intention is to force people into silence. And this is real psychological pressure. But these lawsuits, they're established, they're set up by public officials, by the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, by the Minister of Tourism. And we also have the practice of slaps, of journalists receiving letters from local and foreign firms threatening legal action. So slaps are commonly known as strategic lawsuits against public participation. Now, we know that we've received reports that over the past week, the editor of the Shift News, who was speaking on a panel last week at the International Journalism Festival in Perugia, herself has now received the threat of new libel suits. But this is not a new problem for the Shift News, of course. But in addition to this threat, we also have online harassment and trolling. And this is really vicious. This is like daily vitriol that journalists, critical journalists, have to face. There are these reports of Facebook groups that are actually used to coordinate online attacks against journalists and activists. And we've seen, since Daphne Caruana Galicia's death, we've seen posts and comments celebrating the fact that she was murdered, describing her as Shahara Hadra, which is an evil witch, and calling on fellow members to let her burn in hell. One investigation has found that high-level officials were members of these groups, that they failed to condemn attacks and these comments, and that they only left after there was pressure on them to leave. We also have to have a look at the access to information. So the fact that for journalists on the ground, it's very difficult or critical journalists to have meetings with officials, that their requests for information aren't acknowledged. And again, there's sort of this space for this public scrutiny of sensitive investigations, of the questions that now need to be asked in Malta. That is very much restricted. So I want to conclude by focusing on one of the lines from the Venice Commission report, highlighting the positive obligation of states to protect journalists as an issue directly related to the rule of law. It is an international obligation of the government of Malta to ensure that the media and civil society can play an active role in holding the authorities accountable. Now, Prime Minister Muscat in October made a commitment to us that he would enforce the recommendations of the Venice Commission in October 2018. Well, surely in everything that I presented to you today, that is not happening. And when is the time that he is going to follow up on his commitment, follow up on the case, and start to really make sure that critical journalists in the country are protected? Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. You've highlighted in your conclusion the conclusions of the Venice Commission itself and the obligation to protect journalists, and this leads me to the demand, the claim we stand for of a public inquiry that has been documented by Killian Gallagher. You're a barrister at Doughty Street Chamber. You also sit at the advisory board of Reporters Without Borders in the UK, and you've been closely working with Karina Galicia's family since November 17, working on a specific legal opinion to demand that public inquiry. So what's meant by this demand? Why is it so needed, and how could it achieve to improve the general state of the rule of law in Malta, including protection of journalists?
Thank you. I'll answer those questions over the course of this short presentation. I'm conscious there's other people who want to speak as well. Could I just start by echoing the thanks that others have issued, thanking all of you who've made the time to be here today. And during Andrew's very powerful speech, where he referred to how difficult it is to speak following an introduction like the very warm words we heard from Lord Foulkes, it reminded me of words spray painted on a wall in Malta, which turned into one of The Economist's most popular images for 2018. And some of you may have seen the image. It's an image, one of Malta's busiest junctions, with spray painted words which say, "Speak the truth even if your voice shakes," above the date 16th of October 2017, the day when Daphne was killed. And I just want to start by saying what a privilege it is to work for this incredible family, for Andrew, Matthew, Paul, and their father Peter. And they have continued to speak the truth in the most difficult of circumstances ever since 16th of October 2017. And within weeks, days, even hours of the incredibly brutal assassination of their mother, they have been asking questions and pressing for justice, and it's astonishing to see, and I think those of us in the room who've worked with them have been really astounded to see what they've done, and they have been speaking the truth, and if their voices have been shaking, we haven't heard it. So you asked me, Thomas, just about the public inquiry, what it is and why it's important. So I'm just going to start by giving you some headline points, and then I'll give you an update on where we're at legally and what the current position is. So within a very short period after Daphne's brutal death, we as the lawyers working with the family raised concerns about whether the investigations then underway in Malta were compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. And there were two broad aspects to the concerns that we raised. The first was a specific targeted concern about the lack of guarantees of independence in the criminal investigation, in particular the role of Silvio Valletta. And the second broader issue was a concern about the focus of the criminal investigation. And there were two sub-aspects to that. There was a concern, as Lord Foulkes indicated earlier, that it was focused very much on the front line rather than looking at the masterminds. But also critically, there was a much wider question outside criminal responsibility, and that concerns the wider question of preventability, whether the state could or should have known about the risks to Daphne's life and taken additional steps. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit more about that second issue in a moment. But on the first specific issue about the role of Silvio Valletta, this family had to litigate in order to get a response and to get Silvio Valletta removed. And the circumstances are that the family had to go to the highest court in Malta in order to have him removed. And the concerns which were expressed within days of Daphne's death turned out to be entirely justified. So that specific issue has been resolved, but it's only been resolved after the family having to fight to get it resolved. And a real concern which we on the legal team have is that a grieving, bereaved family should not be expected to have to engage in bruising, lengthy litigation in order to ensure the state's compliance with Article 2 of the European Convention. And that's where we now are at when we look at the issue about the public inquiry, because we initially raised those concerns in December 2017. There was correspondence back and forth, further questions looking at the extent to which the investigation was considering those wider issues, the masterminds issue, but also very importantly, the preventability issue. And when it became apparent by early August 2018 that there was no investigation into that wider question of preventability, the family then made a request for there to be an independent judicial inquiry established in order to look at those questions. Now, those questions are critical for the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia, but also, as Tom has indicated in his powerful presentation, it also raises much wider questions about the rule of law in Malta and also about protection of others. And we are now in a position where, although that request was made at the start of August 2018, there's been a refusal to institute that public inquiry. And that is why, and this is rather hot off the presses, that is why in the last number of days we have been instructed by the family to take action and now to challenge the Prime Minister's refusal in court. And it is most regrettable that 18 months after Daphne's brutal assassination and after engagement since December 2017 on these legal issues, the family have been left with no option but to take action. And for that reason, my solicitor, Tony Murphy from Bat Murphy, wrote to the Attorney General on the 3rd of April, at the end of last week, saying it's clear that the Prime Minister of Malta is unwilling to accede to the family's request for a public inquiry. This is notwithstanding Malta's obligation to convene a public inquiry pursuant to Article 2 of the European Convention and widespread support for a public inquiry. This leaves the family with no option but to challenge the Prime Minister's refusal in court. And the family is now taking formal steps with the filing of a judicial letter to start those proceedings, initially in Malta, and if we need to go to the European Court of Human Rights. But we shouldn't be in this position. The family took a very unusual decision in December 2017 to publish the legal advice that we'd given. Now, many families don't do that. They get that advice behind the scenes. But Matthew, Andrew, Paul and Peter, in a commitment to transparency and to trying to move the process on, decided that they wanted to publish those opinions. So we've given 3 very detailed legal opinions, the international legal team. They've all been published. The arguments are out there since December 2017. And it is most regrettable that they're now in a position where they're having to resort to judicial process to establish their rights. And that's precisely what they had to do about Silvio Valletta, and we're extremely disappointed that we now have to do the same thing. They shouldn't be put through this in circumstances where the position's quite clear. So just summarising briefly, I should start by saying I've been introduced as being part of the international legal team, and I should just make clear I'm instructed by Tony Murphy from Bat Murphy, who many of you will have seen when he was here previously. He's a leading expert internationally in relation to contentious deaths in which there's a suspicion of state neglect or state complicity. And I'm working with free speech expert colleagues from Doughty Street Chambers, Jonathan Price and Jennifer Robinson, but also importantly with Ms. Therese Comodini-Caccia in Valletta, who has expertise in Maltese constitutional, public and criminal law. And that unusual combination of Maltese and international lawyers, free speech lawyers, and lawyers who have expertise in relation to deaths and the protection of life under Article 2 reflects this extremely unusual situation. And I should say, those of us who specialise in advising bereaved families whose loved ones may have been targeted or left unprotected by the state usually find that bereaved families in those circumstances have 2 key questions in common. First, basic factual questions about what went wrong, and then secondly, a question about what lessons should be learned and how can further loss of life be prevented. So people want to know that although nothing can bring their loved one back, lessons can at least be learned so that other families aren't going through this. And those 2 questions, those basic questions which any bereaved family should have answered, remain unanswered for Daphne's family 18 months after her death. So what I wanted to do just very briefly, and you can look at the detailed legal opinions that we've given, is just give you a flavour of some of the key points which we've raised. So we've raised issues concerning both Article 2, the right to life in the European Convention, but also Article 10 of the European Convention also. Now, in terms of Article 2, it's well known, of course, that Article 2 provides that everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. And the European Court of Human Rights has repeatedly held that this protection enjoins the state not only to refrain from the intentional and unlawful taking of life, but also to take appropriate steps to safeguard the lives of those within its jurisdiction. And that's a key issue which has been missing in the investigations so far which have taken place within Malta, the question of potential preventability. Now, many of you may have seen the very powerful evidence which was put together by Daphne very shortly before her own death. She detailed 10 days before her murder the decades of harassment, including misogynistic harassment, which was undoubtedly gender-based, She recorded that 10 days before her murder. She talked about her life, what it had become, and that is available. You can see that it was published and by The Guardian and by others in April 2018. She described those arson attacks on her home, the attempts to cut off her income, the freezing of her bank accounts, the dozens of libel suits brought by ministers and business people, the attacks online, the attacks on the street, critics branding her a witch. And some of you may have seen Andrew and Matthew's brother Paul's very powerful personal piece published over the weekend, where he spoke about the very gendered nature of some of those attacks, where she was described as being menopausal and she was treated in a particular way because she was a woman. And that is all from an interview that she gave in October 2017 for a study by the Council of Europe, in which she was asked to detail that. And that is very powerful evidence of precisely what she predicted would happen, because she predicted, quite rightly and chillingly, that there were many steps which had been taken against her to try to silence her. And you've heard very powerfully from Andrew about how she was someone who wouldn't be silenced. And she worked as a freelancer so that she was free of restriction and she could say what she wanted. And what happened with her death in October 2017 was the ultimate way of attempting to silence her. Now, it obviously comes against a backdrop. This discussion comes against a backdrop of a difficulty with freedom of expression, protection of freedom of expression within the European Union. We know about Jan Kuciak's death, the death of Jan Kuciak and Martina, and also the death in Bulgaria. And there are very real concerns for everyone in the room in circumstances where the kinds of cases which I've done for many years, focusing on Egypt or Iran or Equatorial Guinea, we suddenly find those issues arising here within the European Union, within the Council of Europe, and it raises very fundamental concerns. So in relation to Article 2, the law is very clear that the investigative duty under Article 2 requires there to be an independent and public investigation, which is adequate involvement by the bereaved family into the question of preventability. And that comes from a series of cases in very, very different contexts involving lack of police protection and involving environmental failures. But the case law makes very clear that this family has always been entitled to that kind of investigation, and it's not taking place within Malta. And a concern which we have as the legal team is that you have a situation where within a Council of Europe member state, within a European Union member state, there is a failure to comply with a very basic fundamental requirement of Article 2. Now, of course, this family can ultimately go to the European Court of Human Rights and get a decision in the European Court of Human Rights that there was a breach of the investigative obligation. But the reason they've been doing what they've been doing right from the outset and publishing the legal advice all the way along is because they don't want to have to wait for years to get a judgment from the European Court of Human Rights which says what we know to be the case, which is that there's been a breach of the investigative obligation when the evidence trail has gone cold, and they want action sooner. And that's why it is so important that action is taken to ensure that there is a form of inquiry. Now, some of you will have seen the report which was published by Agnes Calamar from the UN with a panel which included my colleague Helena Kennedy in relation to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And there are some overlaps between the situation that we have here, the situation that we have with Jan Kuciak's assassination, and with Jamal Khashoggi, where you've got a situation where the state, which should be taking responsibility for investigating the question of preventability, simply isn't doing so. And there's a real question for the international community about what we do in those circumstances. Now, in relation to Daphne, there have been some ad hoc steps taken at Council of Europe level and EU level, which have been very powerful and important. But there is a really fundamental question about what we do when the responsible state doesn't initiate the inquiry that it's supposed to initiate. And having an ad hoc investigation into Jamal Khashoggi's death, as the UN had, or having delegations going to Malta to ask questions, that's all very well. But there is there's a wider structural question about how we deal with deaths of journalists in those circumstances when there is no national mechanism doing the job which it should be doing. And I'm conscious of the time, so can I just flag very quickly the fact that we have made very clear in our opinions that this is not like any usual Article 2 type case, although there are those questions which arise for any bereaved family where there's an issue potentially about a failure by the state to protect, or potentially even about state complicity. There are also fundamental questions arising here in relation to Article 10, the right to freedom of expression. And the court has recognised, the European Court of Human Rights, that Article 10 gives rise to a series of positive obligations, and it includes, of course, a positive obligation in relation to any violence or threats of violence directed against those seeking to exercise their Article 10 freedoms. It includes an obligation on the Maltese state to engender an environment in which the freedoms protected by Article 10 may prosper and be enjoyed. But also, and this is very important in the case of Daphne, it also raises concerns regarding source protection. And one of the challenges in this case would be, in any form of judicial public inquiry, there would have to be adequate steps taken to ensure source protection. And that's another key issue here. Now, it's not unusual for the Strasbourg Court to consider Articles 2 and 10 concurrently. Many of you will know of the case of Dink and Turkey, for example, in which it was made clear that the prosecution and conviction of a Turkish journalist for belittling Turkishness was held to have contributed to a public perception that he was an enemy to those of Turkish origin. And it's a result of that stigma that he was murdered. And there was evidence in that case of state involvement or potential state involvement. And what Article 2 and Article 10 require in those circumstances, we say, is there is sufficient evidence to raise a question regarding whether or not Daphne could and should have been protected in a different way. There's sufficient evidence to raise a question regarding whether the threats to her life resulted in the triggering of an obligation like the obligation in the Osman case, for example. And all you need, the European Court of Human Rights has made clear, to trigger the investigative obligation is a realistic question to be raised about whether those matters should be explored. And it's quite clear that there is a realistic question raised here, and that quite low threshold has been passed. It's been clear to those of us who've been working on the case since November 2017 that that's the case. And yet here we are 18 months on without any action having been taken. And the position now is that the family reluctantly but firmly are now having to take action within the Maltese courts. And that's the position that we're now in, a position we should never have been in, because this public investigation, a judicial inquiry into what has happened, could and should have taken place already without the family having to take that ultimate step of going to court. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Killian. We are about to wrap up this panel, and before I leave the floor to the Right Honourable Mr. Chenard, who has been co-sponsoring the panel, I just would like to stress out a few items we have been discussing, thanks to Andrews, Tom, and Killian after Lord Fuchs. There is a clear need for justice. There has been no trial, no in-depth inquiry with the three men arrested in the aftermath of the assassination of Daphne. We still have no clue on which mastermind is behind the case. First. Second, we are clearly in need, there is a realistic question behind that, of a public inquiry to step forward with more preventable action of the Maltese state. There is a need for us to understand whether she could have been protected, whether she should have been protected, and whether Maltese authorities can keep up the challenge. And it's not, it has been clearly documented, Malta has been backsliding of 18 ranks in the World Press Freedom Index of RSF. It keeps backsliding in the upcoming index released on 18 April. And that's why we need lessons to be drawn out of the case. That as pointed out by Killian, Europe cannot keep giving moral speeches about Jamal Khashoggi murder without also inquiring in depth what has been also done in Europe. There has been the murder of Mr. Kupčak in Slovakia. There has been the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, and we still need to step up with clear policy changes all over Europe to better protect press freedom and capability of investigating. And therefore, I turn to Mr. Chenard. You've been co-sponsoring that panel, and I know you wanted to also step in too. So please, if you could be the first one to ask questions or make a statement on that.
I'm sorry that I leave in some minutes because I have to chair a committee at 2 o'clock. Therefore, I was always looking there. First, it was an honor when I was asked to be a co-sponsor of this side event. Second, you asked the question, who heard about your mother before? When I produced in Teatro Manuel the Handel opera Alcina, that was years ago, I heard about her, and somebody wanted to bring us in contact, but it was, meanwhile, I'm so sorry that it was not possible, because I was my whole life journalist, and I will be till the end of my life a journalist, and I'm really very worried what has happened. We have the killed and tortured young woman in Bulgaria. We have the case in Slovakia, and your mother. And what can all what I heard in that time, and it was a longer time, if you produce your opera, you stay longer, it was only positive. Maybe I did not met the people who are blaming your mother. But 1 year ago, I was also in Malta for Council of Europe to investigate the illegal trafficking of culture. And I used this opportunity to be with police, with customs, and with the Minister for Culture, who is automatically also the Minister for Justice. And we spoke, and I told him that what was my investigation before, and when he gave me some answers, I told him, I'm so sorry, but I believe nothing what you said. He was a little bit shocked. Why can I be so brutal in my wording? And I said, come on, this guys you imprisoned. And I have long time in my life, I took care for offenders, and I know a little bit the mentality of offenders. And I said that was not the murders. These guys you selected, and you did it very easy because they had all a little bit a link to drugs, and you have the show what you are making with this is awful. But I thanks everything what I heard, and I want to say to you, to your brothers, you had a brave mother, and I'm sure that she's very proud what you are doing.
Thank you so much. We have still a bit of time to take questions before we leave the room for another committee taking place. Is there anyone wanting to ask questions? Yes, could you please just state your name and organization before asking the question?
If I may, so my name is Sylvia Grundmann. I'm the head of the Media and Internet Division for the moment, but here is already my successor, Artemisa Ciaska. She will take over, and I will move to the Venice Commission. So this is why we are here. We are closely following from the institutions here in the Council of Europe. I would like to give one brief information and then my question. The brief information is that the Steering Committee on Media and Information Society, that is the experts of the member states, they come together twice a year. They are looking also at the situation, safety of journalists, and they came to the conclusion, as this situation is so dire, they have adopted an implementation strategy to strengthen safety of journalists, protection of journalism, and they want to go more in direct contact with the countries to especially work on protection and on prosecution. So I keep it short here. Tom is our observer in the committee. He knows everything about it. As to my question, I might not have grasped it fully, but it is not clear to me what are the obstacles or what is the reasoning against a public inquiry. I would think that in the light of the obligation of the state, it would be in the interest of the state to have it. So I have not understood that. Thank you.
Killian will answer that question, and if need, Tom will also step in.
It's a very important question, and the simple answer is we don't fully understand it either, because a public inquiry is straightforward, and if the Maltese wish to show that, in fact, this is all rumour mill, there's nothing to these allegations, then a public inquiry, independent public inquiry, is the ideal place to do that. We did have an indication on the 5th of October 2018, the lawyers for the family, that the Attorney General was giving active consideration to establishing a public inquiry. That was on the same day that the Constitutional Court in Malta found that there was a breach of Article 2 in relation to Silvio Valletta. So we had what we thought was a chink of light on the 5th of October, but it was followed fairly swiftly with a very difficult, detailed letter a number of weeks later objecting to the idea of a public inquiry for various reasons. And in our third opinion, from before Christmas, from December 2018, we analysed why all of those points that were made in the letter were flawed, and we answered them. And we've given some time. That was the final call to try to avoid litigation. And unfortunately, we've heard nothing back on substance since that time. And here we are in April. And that's why we're now in a position where on the 8th of April, after giving ample time to respond to those points, the family feel they've no option but to litigate. And that's not a step which they would like to have taken. But when we, in August 2018, made the request, Matthew and Andrew's brother, Paul, said, you've nothing to fear but the truth. Because the whole point of an inquiry simply is, these are the questions to be answered. It's an independent process whereby the questions can be answered. And if there's nothing to it, the inquiry process should establish that. So I'm afraid we come to the same point as you, which is, why not? And surely it would deal with these issues and indeed be in the interests of Malta as well as in the interests of the bereaved family.
And for risk of repeating myself, I think we're at a very interesting conjuncture now, that we are 6 months after this mission where we really did challenge public officials. And again, we are just looking at a real lack of political will, not just on this, but on other things. And really what is required, especially after this week's advocacy, is a very clear message from the Maltese authorities that they're going to take these concerns seriously.
Could I add one really short point? Sorry. Just one thing I just should add as well. I'm not sure how many of you will have seen the response that Matthew got to his very powerful speech in Perugia at the International Festival over the weekend. But Matthew, having given a very powerful speech, then ends up being the subject of slurs online and being criticised. And we have found through this whole process that the correspondence has tended to be quite antagonistic. So, for example, right at the outset in December 2017, when our legal opinion was published, there were references to, well, this is neo-colonialist lawyers making references. They don't understand Malta, even though our legal team includes Maltese lawyers. So there has been a real element of antagonism during it, which has been surprising and disappointing. And we've tried to take that heat away over the last number of months. That doesn't quite answer your question, but I think there has been a sense of digging heels in and seeing this as something to oppose. It's been quite adversarial rather than collaborative and constructive. Right. And that may partly explain it. I'm not sure if Andrew thinks that.
We are quite running out of time before we leave the room for another committee session. So to conclude, I'd like to leave the floor to Andrews for a very brief statement, and after we maybe be able to take other questions in front of in the corridor.
Thanks, Thomas. I mean, I'd like to conclude with something positive, at least. When my brothers and I first spoke in this building just over a year ago, it was our mother's word that we had. All we had is her work, and which was being actively discredited by the government. And then there was our testimony, our own experiences. And fortunately, a lot of people believed us. They managed to understand the situation, despite the fact that there was no real independent research on the situation in Malta. Speaking here today, the situation is completely different. There's still no justice for my mother, but now it is beyond doubt that there are serious rule of law failings in Malta. There's a serious corruption problem in Malta, And this has come out in the Venice Commission's report, in Greco's recent evaluation report, and in Moneyval's draft report on money laundering. So now we've established the context in which my mother was assassinated. That is now a fact, and that's hugely reassuring for me and my family, because we no longer have to fight a battle over the narrative. Now we can focus only on justice. And justice is extremely important, not because it will give us a sense of satisfaction or some sort of sense of revenge, but because until the mastermind is brought to justice, there will always be a general suspicion that this person or these people have some sort of influence over the Maltese government. And also because we will unlikely be able to learn the right lessons from what happened until there is full justice. As for Malta's opposition to a public inquiry, I might be cynical, but one of the main reasons I think is public relations. The government, after the police arrested 3 low-level suspects, tried to send out the message that this was case closed. We can now move on and we can focus on Malta's economic growth, and so on. A public inquiry will create a long, drawn-out and very public, news cycle related to my mother's murder, and could obviously implicate people very close to the government.
Thank you. We will have to leave the room for a committee session. So I'd like just briefly thank Daphne's family and Sounds to bring so much energy into investigating and advocacy, making some clear advocacy on what's expected and in the future of Malta, and also every co-sponsors and organizations who have enabled this panel to happen, specifically our friends from the CPJ and from Doughty Street Chamber. Thank you very much.